So the US just bailed out Argentina with $40 billion. And this is while the US government is still in shutdown. The US Treasury literally bought Argentina's pesos, which is a currency that has hyperinflated over 200%. And we're told that this is supposed to be a good investment.
President Trump is now considering doubling his promised bailout to Argentina to $40 billion. Trump praised Argentina's president during his visit to the White House, calling him MAGA all the way.
Now, what's strange is that Argentina is not even one of America's biggest trading partners. Not top 3, not even top 5. And none of this was debated in Congress, it wasn't voted on, and it wasn't really even talked about in the news. And officials are telling us that this is not a bailout. So the question I had is, why are we doing this, and where are we getting the money to pay for it? And it turns out the money is going to come from something most people have never even heard of, which is a fund inside the Treasury called the ESF, the Exchange Stabilization Fund. It's only been used a couple of times throughout history, and now it's going to be used to prop up and essentially bail out an entire foreign economy, which happens to be at the expense of American farmers and taxpayers.
Especially now that President Trump has floated the idea of bringing down meat prices by importing beef from Argentina, which cattle ranchers across the country say will not help.
Now, the official story is that the US is doing this out of the goodness of our heart, that Argentina is struggling and they represent the MAGA values, right?
I'm with this man because his philosophy is correct.
So the US should help them stabilize their economy. Which, by the way, is completely ironic when you consider that Argentina's President Javier Milei ran for election on free markets and no bailouts from the state. But they're getting one of the biggest bailouts of all time. So none of that made sense to me. But the more I looked into this, the more connections I started to notice between Wall Street, the US, and a couple of very powerful investors with deep interests in Argentina's debt. These are people who have been betting on Argentina's recovery for years. And if Argentina's bonds are allowed to collapse, billions of those dollars would disappear. And when you realize who's now sitting at the Treasury and who they worked with in the past, you'll see how it's all connected and it'll start to make a lot of sense. So in today's video, I want to show you how the US just bailed out a foreign country and why, and what this says about the new financial war between the US and China. So with that said, let's get into it. Hi, my name is Andrei Jikh. Hope you're doing well. Come for the finance and stay for the bailout. So before I get into what this means for the US and for China and the dollar, let me first explain how it actually happened, because obviously what the Treasury did was not approved or passed through Congress, wasn't voted on, and it didn't even come from the Federal Reserve. It actually came from a completely separate pool of money, and it's one that very few people even know exists. It's called the ESF, the Exchange Stabilization Fund. Now, the ESF was actually created way back in 1934 during the Great Depression, with profits the US made from revaluing gold. So at the time, President Franklin Roosevelt literally changed the price of gold from $20.67 an ounce to $35 per ounce. So all of a sudden, the US government just declared that its gold reserves were worth 70% more than they were the day before. That repricing caused a huge profit. It created a huge benefit of billions of dollars for the Treasury. But instead of letting Congress just spend it all, Roosevelt decided to lock it away in a new fund that could be used for emergency stabilization. The idea was that the Treasury could use this secret pool of money to intervene in currency markets for things like stabilizing the dollar, or if we really wanted to, getting involved in foreign economies without ever needing Congress's approval to do it. And for the last 90 years, it's been sitting inside the Treasury, and it was only used a couple of times throughout history that we know of, at least publicly. For example, it was used in 1995 to bail out Mexico during the peso crisis.
The peso also continued to collapse. It has lost 40% of its value to the dollar in the last 3 weeks.
Again in 2008, during the global financial collapse, and again during the pandemic to backstop credit markets when the Fed ran out of things to do, like lowering interest rates past zero. And now again this time, to prop up another country's currency and by extension their economy. Now the question is this funded by our tax dollars? And the answer is yes and no. The Treasury isn't literally sending Argentina just a blank check, right? At least not directly. What they're doing is they're using something called a currency swap. Through the Exchange Stabilization Fund, the Treasury buys Argentina's pesos from Argentina's central bank, giving them US dollars in return. In theory, then, those pesos act as collateral. And in practice, the Treasury is now holding a hyperinflating currency, a melting ice cube on behalf of US taxpayers. Now that's just the first $20 billion. The second half of this deal was more recent and is expected to come from private investors and hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, banks, etc. Now, you have to ask, if you're a bank, you might be like, why do I have to do this? I don't want to do this. And the only reason they're willing to is because the US Treasury is guaranteeing the security of their money and some other perks I'll explain soon, but this is also why they want collateral, right? They want something to back the loan with. Because if Argentina defaults and it can't pay back the US, it's gonna be the Treasury that gets hurt, and by extension, US taxpayers, which are kind of left holding that bag. So are taxpayers paying? Not initially, but if it turns out to be a bad investment, then yes. So then, why Argentina is the next question? Because if you think about it, there's arguably a lot of other countries around the world that could use this money. It's not just Argentina that needs help. The US might need it too. So first, let me just explain what the official story is of why Argentina, and then I'll get into some more interesting revelations. So here's the official story. According to the Treasury, this isn't what it looks like, right? It's not a bailout.
Not a bailout at all. There's no money being transferred. The ESF has never lost money. It's not going to lose money here.
It's being called a currency stabilization partnership, which is a fancy way of saying the US is helping Argentina stabilize its peso by buying it directly through the Exchange Stabilization Fund. Now, the person in charge of this plan is, of course, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, one of the smartest macro investors on Wall Street, because before joining the Treasury, he spent years running a hedge fund and managing billions of dollars for one of the most successful investors in history. Now, in his first month as Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent has been very loud about one specific thing, and that is that the United States has to take a bigger role in global markets again.
And he is committed to getting China out of Argentina. They're all over the place in Latin America.
He argues that after decades and decades of letting the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the World Bank, and China dominate the funding of the developing world, the US needs to get back on track. In other words, he wants to slow down this chart right here. Remember this one? It's the chart that shows decades and decades of de-dollarization. So the goal is to defend the dollar's global role by helping allies stabilize their economies before China does it with the yuan, which we know will be backed by gold. So that's the idea. If the US doesn't help struggling countries, it's not going to be able to exert its influence on the world, and China will instead, which of course it doesn't want. Okay. So he's like, Argentina is going to be a good example of how we're going to start doing this.
So we are going to use Argentina as an example. We back up our allies.
And his reasoning is that Argentina is a country with huge potential, right? Big reserves of natural gas and lithium, farmland. But right now it's just crippled by bad monetary policy, right? Inflation over 200%, multiple currency rates, a history of defaults. His argument is that by stabilizing the peso and bringing Argentina back into the global financial system, the US can do both, help an ally and protect the dollar's influence across Latin America, which also happens to be a region that China's been trying to do that with for years. Okay, but when you really look into this story though, you have to ask, cui bono, as they say, right? Who benefits? How does the money flow and who does it go to? Which private funds have exposure to Argentina and its debt? And this is where the story starts to take a little bit of a turn. So here's where things start to look a little strange. And the more I looked into it, the more I noticed some really interesting connections between Wall Street, the Treasury, and investors with really big interests in Argentina's debt. Now, before I show you that, I want to give a quick thank you to CyberGhost VPN for supporting this channel and making videos like this possible. With over 38 million users and more than 20,000 5-star reviews on Trustpilot, CyberGhost is one of the most trusted ways to stay private online. Most people don't even realize that your internet provider, your workplace, and even your home Wi-Fi can see exactly what you do online, even if you're in incognito mode. CyberGhost encrypts your connection and routes it through secure servers in over 100 countries so your data stays yours, not someone else's. It also lets you unlock geo-restricted content from 40 streaming platforms like Netflix, Prime Video, Disney+, and more, so you can access shows and prices available in other countries with just one click. You can use it on all major devices and protect up to 7 at once, so you can even share with family and friends. And since they keep no logs, not even CyberGhost knows what you do online. And the best part is right now, they're offering an 84% discount plus 4 months free. That's just $2.03 a month with a 45-day money-back guarantee, so it's totally risk-free. Don't forget to click the link in the description down below to get the special discount. Thank you to CyberGhost VPN for sponsoring this segment, and now let's get back to it. So here's how some very powerful people placed bets on Argentina. These are just a few of them, and I have to be very careful here for obvious reasons, so this is for entertainment and research purposes only, but you can verify all of this yourself. There's at least 2 big funds that we know of. Funds like Discovery Capital, which was founded by Robert Citron, and Soros Fund Management. But where it gets interesting is that the current US Treasury used to work under George Soros at the Quantum Fund, where he managed billions of dollars and worked with the same people who run these funds and have deep investment interests in Argentina's economy. So the person who's now running the Treasury, the one who's approving this entire $40 billion deal, is the same person who spent decades making money from these types of trades. Now, that doesn't mean anything illegal is happening, but I think it's an interesting coincidence that's at least worth mentioning, because a lot of those funds bought billions of dollars worth of Argentina's bonds that were already trading as what's called distressed debt. By the way, distressed debt just means any kind of bond that trades below 70 cents on the dollar. It's kind of a polite way of saying the market thinks you might never get your money back. High chance of default. And Argentina's 2035 and 2041 sovereign bonds, which makes up most of what Wall Street holds, have been trading as low as 25 to 35 cents on the dollar in 2024 and 2025. That is deep distressed. That's most likely you are definitely not getting your money back. So they made a bet. And the bet was that the new president, Javier Milei, could come in and fix Argentina's economy by cutting out unnecessary spending. Remember all those videos way back in the day? It's about taking that chainsaw to government bloat and removing all of it. And if he could fix the economy, that would make Argentina's bonds valuable again. But that didn't end up happening, right? Inflation stayed above 200%, the peso has kept collapsing, and those same bonds have fallen more than 30%. Argentina's risk premium, which is the price that investors charge to hold its debt, increased exponentially. So every day that the peso goes down, the portfolios that hold those bonds are just bleeding money. What that means then is some very powerful people are losing a lot of money. But now fast forward to July 2025. Out of nowhere, the US Treasury steps in and says, don't worry guys, we got you. We're gonna stabilize your currency without congressional approval. We're gonna use the ESF mechanism, right? And yeah, that helps secure a potentially strategic partner. But as a side effect, It also happens to save billions of dollars for the exact funds and people that placed those bets on the recovery that never ended up happening, at least not organically. And because the official story doesn't tell us that this is a bailout, that's not the framing, no one can really criticize it as market intervention. But behaviorally, it looks like one. The money is coming from the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which, remember, sits inside the Treasury. So if those pesos lose value, which they are, it's the Treasury that takes the hit. And when the Treasury takes the hit, that shortfall gets filled with new debt. New debt that taxpayers ultimately repay. And this actually has had real negative consequences on people like US farmers. They're struggling because of costs and drought conditions and grain and beef prices. In other words, on a practical level, we are subsidizing private investors and our competitors. So this is where a lot of people have that problem with what's happening, because it also sets a very bad example. The US government is now publicly saving billionaire investors who made bets that went bad. So then if this becomes the model, doesn't it tell other hedge funds that the US can save you as long as you can, work out a backdoor deal, and it can just be reframed as, we're going to defend the dollar, right? We're going to defend American values. But the reality is that the US is already running multi-trillion-dollar deficits. We're borrowing to fund programs, and somehow we're supposed to have an extra $40 billion laying around to gamble on another country's hyper-inflated currency. So that doesn't make much sense. But let me just tie it all together and explain how this story is part of a much bigger picture. Because yes, this definitely helps Argentina. And it definitely helps the billionaire friends of this administration. But I don't think it's just about Argentina. It's also about the US fighting its war with China over the idea of what money should look like in the future. Because think about what's happening. China's getting ready to build its gold corridor, right? The node of vaults across Asia, Africa, Latin America. And they're literally creating a parallel financial system backed by their economy with the money that's redeemable for gold. And the US has also been doing kind of the same thing, but in reverse. So this bailout of Argentina, I don't think is some random act of charity, right? It's not altruism, and the president's not doing it just to be nice. He's doing it because it's supposed to telegraph to the world that the US still has that power to stabilize economies whenever it wants. China might be lending in yuan backed by gold. The US is now lending dollars backed by treasuries, right? And Argentina is sort of this test case scenario because it's the one Latin American country that's been slowly getting closer and closer to China. Because over the last few years, China's banks have lent Argentina billions of dollars to build things like power plants and railways and nuclear projects. They've been trying to pull Argentina into their sphere of influence, if you will, just like they've done with dozens of other countries across Africa and Asia. So the US is like, whoa, hold on a minute. You guys are becoming too close of friends. We're like, we'll lend you $40 billion if you need. And that's to block China's influence and its play to keep Latin America in the dollar system. And if it works, if Argentina can stabilize, which seems to be totally conditional on Javier Milei's re-election, because President Trump said if he does not get re-elected, the US won't support him.
I'm with this man because his philosophy is correct. And he may win and he may not win, but I think he's going to win. And if he wins, we're staying with him. And if he doesn't win, we're gone.
But if he does win, and if it works, I think we're going to see this strategy play out again and again, but with other countries. There's already rumors that other currency stabilization partnerships could be next for countries like Brazil, very important, Colombia, Egypt, Kenya.
The Obama administration missed a big opportunity in the 8 years he was in, as many Latin American governments went center-right. So we are seeing Argentina, Paraguay, Ecuador, Bolivia.
Countries that have all taken huge amounts of infrastructure loans from China that are now drowning in debt. Like Brazil, for example, owes tens of billions to China's state banks through the Belt and Road Initiative, and it's already part of BRICS, right? Colombia's peso has fallen over 20% last year, and it's facing serious inflation pressure. Egypt, which is one of China's biggest borrowers in Africa, is also on the verge of another IMF rescue. These are exactly the kind of candidate countries where the US could step in and try this out with. And remember, this is not the first time this has happened. Like I said, it's happened before in 1995 when we bailed out Mexico, right? For the similar reasons, to keep it from falling into financial chaos that could have spilt over into the US. But this time it's a little different because back then, the world was still on the dollar standard. But now that's changing. And the US is playing offensive defense, if you will. It also just happens to benefit some of the wealthiest people in the world, like Discovery Capital, which is one of the biggest holders of Argentina's debt, run by a former Soros fund manager, and the current Secretary of Treasury, who also worked under George Soros, running billions at the same company. That's all just kind of a side added benefit, which I'm sure has nothing to do with this. I'd love to know what you think, though. As always, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Smash the like button, subscribe if you haven't already. I'd love to see you back here next week. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.